Everyone. This is Michelle Rich from the Iowa Afterschool Alliance. We're pleased to have you here today. Um, today, I'm joined by my colleague, Brittany Samuelson.
Hi, everybody.
We're going to talk about STEM and literacy in out-of-school time, focusing mostly on a framework of quality activities that's focused on STEM, but I think you'll see that you can use it for any curricular area. And then we'd like to talk about integrating literacy into STEM in some ways that you can do that. We're really excited to present this. It's good timing as you are winding down summer and thinking about fall and those structural pieces that you'll have to put in place. Obviously, planning around this tool takes time, and so we recommend that you either identify activities early in the year and have them on hand for throughout the year, or you allow some planning time to be put in order to develop high quality activities to this caliber. Brittany and I will be co-facilitating today, and so you'll hear from both of us. And like I had mentioned before we got started, if you have any questions, please ask them over the phone or on the computer, and you can type in the chat box. We've included our PowerPoint in the lower right-hand corner, and so you can follow along using those materials or for reference later. The tool we're going to be talking about is the Dimensions of Success tool. And I know a few of you have seen this tool before, but it's really great to reiterate the value of this framework in developing high quality activities. So we're going to go through it just briefly here to begin with, and then we're going to show you some actual activities and critique them and talk about how they can be improved to include more literacy and also to align with this framework. You can see that the Dimensions of Success tool includes 4 domains, and there are categories of, there are criteria under each of those. We're going to go through them each distinctly, and so we can get a better idea of what they include. So the 4 domains are features of the learning environment, which includes organization, materials, and space utilization. Activity engagement, including participation, purposeful activities, and engagement with STEM. The STEM knowledge and practices piece is around content learning, inquiry and reflection. And then youth development in STEM includes relationships, relevance, and youth voice. So you can see that really, apart from the engagement with STEM under activity engagement, really the only STEM-specific domain is this orange STEM knowledge and practices. And really, you can put in literacy knowledge and practices, history knowledge and practices, science. You can put in any curricular area, and it really still makes sense. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Brittany, would you like to talk about features of the learning environment?
Sure. So features of the learning environment really focuses on kind of the logistics of the activity that you're going to be doing. So is the activity planned? We want to make sure that the activity is planned and not that you're kind of just flying by the seat of your pants kind of thing, but that you've got things timed out, you know what materials you need, you kind of are anticipating these things ahead of time. So that way, all of the time that's dedicated to the activity can be used for actual enriching activities. Are materials available? So thinking through the activity and everything you'll need, do you have those materials prepared so that way you're not wasting time during the activity to find these materials? Having those ready and prepared beforehand allows you to really get into the activity right away with the children so you don't lose their attention. Do the activities flow well or transition smooth? So thinking through how you're going to go from instruction to actually doing the activity to reflection, and thinking through how much time you're going to allot for each, and making sure that those transitions go well. That's all kind of what's encompassed under organization. So thinking through the preparation steps that are needed for the activity. Materials, we really want to look at whether the materials are both engaging and appropriate for the youth. So materials can be appropriate for the youth. If you're dealing with younger youth, make sure that their dexterity matches what materials you're using for the activity. Make sure that they're not too simple for older youth, things like that, things that they can actually use to engage in the activity and get the learning outcomes that you want from it. And also, are they engaging? Are the youth interested in working with this material? Does it make them excited? So, doing something different maybe for activities and getting them engaged right from the beginning with those exciting materials. And then finally, space utilization. So this is all about the space you're using during the activity, the logistics of it. Is it conducive to actually doing the activity? If you're doing something that requires tabletops to build something, do you have enough of those for the youth? Um, are there distractions around? Do you have to share the space with a lot of other different groups that might take away from the activity? Thinking through all of those things, and we realize that there are some barriers to what programs can use for spaces, but trying to think through those things beforehand and being proactive about making sure that you're setting yourself up for success for an engaging activity before you even begin.
What we've seen in our observations using this tool, I think the most common hiccups in this area are that time is not used well, where the activity is either too short or too long. And in those cases, if it's too short, another activity on hand is useful to make up that time. Hopefully something that's aligned to the learning goal, but it might be a whole different activity. And if it goes too long, then you haven't really considered what the attention span is of your kiddos. So those are things to keep in mind. And also this idea of whether or not the materials actually work and whether or not they're appropriate for the activity is important. So doing the activity beforehand, if possible, to work through it and make sure that all the working parts are working. If you have batteries, for instance, that the batteries are charged. Those are all things that are going to not, if you were to have an observation using this tool, you would not get full points in this area for some of those hiccups. Going on, the next piece is activity engagement. We look at participation, purposeful activities, and engagement with STEM. So some key questions here are around whether or not all children and youth are participating actively and equally. Obviously, with your activity, you want everyone to be participating at the same level for complete engagement across all youth. And then this was oriented towards STEM, of course, and we know that sometimes boys get more attention in STEM, so they're very sensitive to boys versus girls participating more. So just keeping an eye on whether or not there's full engagement across all youth. Do the activities relate to STEM learning goals? So is there a goal to the activity, not just to do it, but rather a higher question that's being answered, for instance, or something related to STEM that you're answering? And then finally, engagement with STEM, we talk about hands-on and minds-on. We know that after school is a great venue for hands-on activities, but we also need to make sure that the activities are minds-on, where kids are also doing cognitive work while they're participating and actively involved in creating or making something or doing. So those are both really important things to think about: the hands-on component and the minds-on. Often in this area, we see one or the other, where it might be a fully cognitive task that they're doing, but it's not terribly hands-on. Or in a lot of cases, like I'm sure with some of your activities that you've seen over the years, it's very hands-on, but they're not asking a larger question or not digging deeper into a content area. So that's what we want to see, is minds-on and hands-on.
I think it's also important to note that even though we want all of the youth to be fully participating and equally participating, sometimes some kids just are not feeling it that day. But if there's an effort on your part or on the staff's part to try to engage those youth that are not totally participating, that is kind of what's important here. We do realize the realities of the programs, but to really have that high quality STEM activity, we'd like to see engagement with all youth, at least an attempt.
Barb had some questions related to the other domain, features of the learning environment. She asks, what are some attention spans that work well for various grades? And then would gender groups at times be beneficial for STEM? I think, I'm not a developmental expert, so I can't say for sure what attention spans are appropriate for different grades, but I think generally you can assume that younger kids are going to have shorter attention spans than older youth, and then it's very dependent and variant on the activity itself. I imagine that if you have an activity that's very hands-on, they might be engaged for longer periods, and then if it's minds-on and hands-on, I think that's even better to equip them with a greater attention span on the activity. And then gender groups at times are beneficial for STEM. I would play it by ear, and you know your kids better than others. If you have some particularly dominating boys and girls where they could dominate the group, that's just a matter of your own discretion as to how you manage that. If it's easier for the facilitator to break into gender groups, I don't think that's harmful. I personally am a proponent of genders working together, but I think it's up to you and how you can manage the group best. You don't want a particularly dominating youth not allowing others to participate fully. So those are my 2 cents. Brittany, I don't know if you have anything to add on those points.
No, I don't think so. I think a lot of it really is trial and error. You know, you might try some STEM activities a certain way and realize that that activity was way too long and my youth could not stay engaged. So making alterations to that. And again, the same for gender. I think if you're having a hard time engaging the girls, it might be a good idea to switch to a gender-based program where the girls can be separated and they kind of have the freedom to engage and participate without domination from boys. If that's happening in your program, it might not be.
Mm-hmm. Billy says Oak Ridge uses gender-specific grouping as well. Will include art and music that is related to the project. Also use small group instruction and put limits on some activities. Yeah, so it really depends on your program and what works best for you. And Brittany has a good point. I mean, sometimes an activity you can do it yourself, and when you do it with kids, it's just totally different. Or some timings just don't work right, or the flow of an activity isn't exactly how you planned. But this is really an ideal and something you should strive for, and just those boxes you should tick as you're developing an activity. And certainly they're not going to work every time, but you can certainly improve them over time. Next, we're going to get into STEM knowledge and practices, and keep in mind that, like we had mentioned before, this you could incorporate any curricular area. It doesn't have to be STEM. This tool was designed around STEM, but we really see this as any curricular area. But we're going to talk specifically about STEM right now, but be thinking that you can really put in any curricular area there.
Yeah, so STEM knowledge and practices here. We're talking about uh, making sure that they're learning the STEM content, which is obviously important in STEM activities or whatever activity that you're doing, making sure that the concepts are accurate that you're teaching them. So we realize that not all staff or program directors are experts in STEM and got their major in science or engineering, but making sure that you do your due diligence to at least understand some of the basic concepts that will be conveyed through the activity. So that'll take, again, some preparation beforehand to make sure that you're prepared for any questions that students may ask. And this doesn't mean learning physics overnight, but it does mean kind of understanding some of the more simple concepts that you'll be teaching those youth. And we'll really be focusing in evaluations, if we ever would do a site visit, on what questions are students asking, what questions are the youth asking, which can really also give you a good picture of if they're understanding it or if you need to do some more explanation on concepts. So always pay attention to those. Something else that's important, especially with STEM activities, is the inquiry part. And so that's making sure that students and youth can be engaged in the scientific method. So whether that's making predictions beforehand or conducting experiments or observations on their own, making hypotheses, whatever that looks like for your youth, and obviously younger youth, that might look a lot more simple than it does for older youth, but making sure that they're genuinely getting to do the activity and interact with it and participate in that scientific method. And then finally, the reflection piece, which is huge, I think, for any curriculum area, whether it's STEM or literacy or anything, but realizing how this applies to their lives or how it applies to the STEM concepts that they've learned. So how does this activity, why does it matter? Why, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Reflecting on their hypotheses, what they've learned, seeing how it makes sense in what they've learned, and really it's kind of up to you to ask those prompting questions to get them to do that reflection on their own and not just telling them what you're hoping that they'll learn from it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is an area where we see a lot of activities struggle because they don't allow for the time to reflect or to really work through the scientific method. They don't pre-plan for front-loading questions. For instance, we'll see an activity here, if we can make it play, making slime or oobleck, and asking some pre-questions around, what do you think will happen if we do this? Mm-hmm. What's your prediction about these different materials and what we're going to create? And then coming back to it over and over again in the activity so you can assess the progress to answer those questions. So we see a lot of times that activities don't have much purpose, which was another domain, but is related to this. Don't have much purpose other than just doing the activity. There's not much thought. It's not very minds-on, so you can tell that the kids aren't quite getting the concepts because they're not talking about anything specific to the STEM learning goals. They might just say, ooh, or, oh, this is weird. And that's really the facilitator facilitator's job to say, why is it weird? What are you feeling? And have them describe what they're doing. That way they can make more sense out of what they're doing, and it's not just an activity to do an activity. And Billy, absolutely, reflection is so important, and it allows you, yes, to pick up on some misconceptions that they might have, whether or not they got some of the concepts, or just to give them time to think through what they just did and the process that they just went through. So what does it mean to mix different different materials? Is that a chemical reaction? What does it mean to have a chemical reaction? Have them talk about how they might use the material. So you'll see in our video that some of these questions are asked and prompted by the facilitator, and that's really the job of the facilitators, to ask questions, not always answer all of them, because like we had said, not every facilitator is going to be a STEM expert, and we don't expect them to be. But there should be some pre-identified concepts that you're trying to get across, and they might be very simple, like understanding a chemical reaction or understanding how materials are made. But the facilitator's job is to get kids inquiring about the concept, not always answering the questions in full. Mm-hmm. So the last domain is youth development in STEM, and we talk about relationships, relevance, and youth voice. And I think for most of you this is going to be common sense, but it always helps to think about it very intentionally as you're going into an activity. The first question is around dynamics, student to facilitator dynamics and student to student dynamics. Is the facilitator using positive language? Is the facilitator encouraging youth to keep asking questions? Or do they shut them down immediately? Well, keep doing your activity, keep going. And sometimes keep going could be encouraging, and sometimes it might be discouraging. So it really depends on what the tone and what that dynamic is. And then student to student dynamics, we talk about domination of certain youth before. This really has to do with, are they collaborating? Are they working well together? Is there encouragement happening between students? The next piece is relevance. Very important for kids to have interest in activities. And something that I think is especially important when we talk about STEM, because there is so much relevance to our day-to-day lives. So are you able to make connections between the activity that they're doing and their everyday lives? And this could easily be through a literacy activity, reading a book that is more relatable, or introducing them to a concept and giving it context through a literacy activity or a reflection activity. So there are different ways that you can make connections between the activity and everyday lives, and it might be through prompting questions and so forth. But that relevance piece is very important for youth. And then finally, youth voice. Are students encouraged to lead activities or select their own projects or activities? So is there a component in there for youth voice? And most of you, I would assume, believe that youth can have a voice regardless of age. However, the boundaries might be more firm as they are younger. But is there a component of youth voice in your activity? So are they able to select the materials that they use? That might be a part of youth voice. Or are they able to select the type of activity they do based on a higher question. And you identify the question and then ask them to identify an activity that could support coming up with answers to that question. So I think there are different ways that you can incorporate youth voice, but just an important piece to be intentional about.
Mm-hmm. And I think something that we see a lot with youth voice is that some of it can be kind of like surface level, which isn't what we're going for. So allowing youth to pick where they sit or pick their partner isn't really the depth of youth voice that we want. That's kind of simplified and not quite what we're going for.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brittany. I'll pause here. Any questions about DOS as a whole? You can see that together it's a very well-rounded framework for a high-quality activity. And we understand that, you know, this is going to take some planning when you're talking about identifying STEM concepts and making sure that there's good time in there for those front loading of questions and making predictions and building a hypothesis. Thank you. And then a time for reflection. So there's some planning that goes into it, but I assure you that when the activity is developed according to this framework, it really has significant impact on student learning. And you know, if they're minds on and hands on, they're having fun while learning. Barb asked for resources to use this tool. Yes, we will get you resources after this webinar. There is a program planning tool that that you can use to develop lesson plans according to this framework. But I'd be interested to hear more from you about what you need to further implement this tool. So Barb, we'll follow up with you, but I'll get you resources for sure. I'm going to attempt to play a video. It doesn't look like it's loading. So we will have to skip the video, unfortunately. But what you would see if you looked this up and you have the link, so I encourage you to go and check out this video. This was made by the Iowa Children's Museum, and they do after-school activities, and they've been a part of our STEM Active Learning Community Partners Group for many years, and they're very supportive of DOS and using DOS to evaluate their programming offerings. And so they did an UBLEC activity long before DOS came on the scene, and then they used DOS to evaluate the quality of their UBLEC activity. And what they found was that they didn't have enough inquiry. Kids were just making UBLEC, and while they really loved it and thought it was cool, it didn't have much purpose. So it was very hands-on and not very minds-on. And they didn't allow for reflection. And so when you access this video, you can see that they ask prompting questions for kids. They make them think about the relevance to their lives, how they might use Oobleck. And, the kids are young, so they're coming up with some pretty creative answers. But at this stage, that creativity is so important for them to be thinking about purpose and intent, the the usefulness of materials, and so just having them think a little bit higher order rather than just doing the activity is the heart of the quality of the Oobleck activity. Really, what you've probably done before is just making Oobleck, and the kids get really into it. But it's not enough just to have them do something. You really need to prompt them to ask some bigger questions. Why is Oobleck so fascinating? It's liquid and a solid, and it's strange. Well, why is it strange that a material would be liquid and solid? Getting them to ask some of those higher order questions. So sorry we couldn't play the video, but you have the link there. Go check it out. We wanted to talk about integrating STEM and literacy, and so just some things to think about. Brittany, do you want to talk about these items?
Sure.
Okay.
So like we mentioned before, there will be some STEM concepts that you'll want to integrate throughout the activity. And that's also a good way to incorporate literacy as well by emphasizing key vocabulary, and that can be the same thing as your key concepts for STEM. So thinking about what's appropriate for age, and then using that to create IDing the words or spelling lessons based on what vocabulary is coming up in the STEM project. And along that line, also incorporating a piece of fiction or non-fiction text that goes along with the project. So there's lots of books out there, and I'm sure you all are aware of them, where you read the story and then there's a project that or an activity that goes along with it. And you can point out the key vocabulary vocabulary that might also be coming up in those texts as well. And I think this also adds a little bit of relevance for the youth too, to see um, why this activity matters and how it is reflected in the real world or in the fiction world that they might be reading about. Allowing youth to read activity instructions or reflection questions afterwards that could help. Um, Writing out hypotheses or their procedures that they want to do to conduct the activity through the scientific method. A lot of the processes that we talk about with inquiry could be written out for youth to practice their writing and literacy, and for you to incorporate literacy throughout that. And then also creating like an engineering journal or something with a cool name so that youth can reflect on the activity that they just did in a journal, which they can use to practice their writing as well, and reading reflection questions too.
We talk about worksheets being bad, and I would agree that just having kids do a worksheet is not very supportive of learning goals. However, I think in this circumstance, you could create a framework for a worksheet where they are writing down the process or the scientific method and the different components of the activity. So you can work in writing at different parts of the activity. And Julia says that she's going to be using a journal for the whole year. I think that's great. We've seen really creative uses of journaling, and this is another great example where I like the idea of an engineering journal or something maybe from the real world. I don't know if engineers have particular types of journals that they use, or you never know. But I like the idea of incorporating real world activities into the STEM activity. So just being intentional about the literacy opportunities that come about in a STEM activity will really enhance the program quality that you're offering, and really underpin the outcomes you're trying to make or achieve with these kids. So just to reiterate, vocabulary. You know, I know that you all know that you can find vocab lists according to grade level. And I'm sure they're out there on Google. And finding really creative ways to work in vocabulary. I don't know if in reflection time you could do a word search or develop your own worksheet where they get those additional vocabulary words in there. The fiction or nonfiction text that aligns with the STEM activity. So we're going to talk about an example of marshmallow towers next. And there are, I'm sure, great books out there around structures and bring that context into the activity. Reading activity instructions, writing out hypotheses and the activity process, and then reflection through writing. So lots of different ways that you can integrate literacy, and like I said, they're pretty common sense, but as long as we're intentional about making sure that there's time and appropriate support for these activities within the broader STEM activity are really important. We want to share an example with you about how a pretty common activity can be improved. We've seen in our site observations, we've seen a couple activities where they make marshmallow towers, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And so we want to walk through what the activity looks like, and in those 4 domains, what we might do to enhance the activity to make sure it's of quality and that kids are learning something beyond just doing something with their hands. So if you're not familiar with marshmallow towers, usually it's toothpicks and marshmallows or spaghetti and marshmallows, dried spaghetti and marshmallows, where kids are asked to build a structure. And in our observations, it's been pretty wide open, the structure that they're able to make, and there's not much guidance around the type of structure. And what we've seen in the past has been that there's not a lot of front loading with this activity and not a lot of reflection. So we're going to talk more about that. But first, we want to talk about features of the learning environment. So remember here, we're talking about materials, organization, and space utilization. And um, so, one of our questions as Brittany and I were walking through our recommendations for this activity was whether or not marshmallows are really appropriate for all ages. Um, Certainly they're appealing for kids in general, and um, and the big question is whether they're appropriate. And we've seen kids get really distracted by the marshmallows and really get subsumed by this idea that at the end of the um, the activity they'll be able to eat the marshmallows. Um, so while it's a cheap and easy um, material for this activity, and it's very appealing, you really do want to ask the question whether or not it's too distracting. We've seen this activity done with marshmallows, or of course marshmallows, but um, dried spaghetti and and toothpicks. And we've noticed that the dried spaghetti doesn't always hold up very well. So this is just one thing that it would help to do the activity beforehand and really test out whether or not the dried spaghetti can make a good um, tower. And then just to reiterate, doing the activity ahead of time can help you make sure that it works and that you have sufficient time allotment for the different components of your activity. So making sure that you include time for reflection and discussion throughout the activity, front-loading questions, so kids have some context and some higher order things to think about while they're doing the hands-on activity. I think all our suggestions for features of the learning environment.
Great. For the next one, activity engagement, we're talking again about participation, purposeful activities, and engagement with STEM. So again, this is really about hands-on, minds-on activities. Obviously, building towers is very hands-on for youth, and they love it. But we want to make sure that the minds-on components are being incorporated, which is something that we've seen that is lacking sometimes in this activity. So ways to get minds-on incorporated into the activity is to think about creating a goal, a STEM learning goal for the youth. So, um, who can build the tallest tower works if you also incorporate ideas about weight and stability in there as well. Or um, make a structure that looks like your house. So that way you can ask questions, reflection questions about, okay, how does how is the house built to provide the most sturdiness and stability? You know, things like that. So that way they're not just